Welcome once again to the Pocono Liars Club's Zoom chat. We have a very fun time this time. It's going to be two interesting guests. I'll start by introducing Peter David. These two guests, I should mention before I get too far, are giants in the industry when it comes to comics, graphic novels, and such. You have to know their names if you've read anything. Peter David is here. He is somebody who writes both comic books and novels as well. I've read quite a few of his novels. Got quite a big shelf of them. But he also does things like, he's written for comic books like Aquaman, Supergirl, Spider-Man, X-Factor, and of course a lot of Star Trek novels, including your own world, Star Trek, I should mention. We can talk about that a little bit more. Written for television, Babylon 5, one of my favorite TV shows. Peter has got tremendous amount of experience in all kinds of writing, and I'm thrilled to have him here again and see him. Hi, Peter. Next is Mark Waid. Mark is an old friend, and when I say that, I mean that literally. Mark and I went to high school and college together, and went to movies and played Dungeons and Dragons together and all that kind of stuff. And he went on to become very, very famous. Mark has written quite a few big books. When I knew him, he was such a Superman fan, and I knew his dream would always be to write Superman books, and he accomplished his dream, so I got to give him credit for that. He's written Superman, Justice League, Spider-Man's, and Archie. He's had his own comic book company that he's worked on. You might have read his graphic novel that he did with Alex Ross called Kingdom Come, which is one of the best-selling graphic novels of all time. I wish they'd make Birthright into the new Superman movie, and they just keep ignoring it. Anyway, I am thrilled to have both of you guys here as guests. Hi!
Hi.
Hey! Now, do you want to add anything to what I just said first before we start talking?
Well,
I didn't leave anything out. I didn't say anything wrong.
That's a pretty good summation, I thought. I think between Peter and I, we have, like 75 years worth of experience in the industry, something like that.
Yeah. If you were going to do a panel on experts, these would be the two guys you'd be calling. So everyone here should be appreciating that and send us some questions. Yeah, let's start with this. When you're writing for a comic or a graphic novel or something like that, it is tremendously different from writing regular novels. And Peter, I'm going to ask you this question first, and then we'll go talk in more details later. What do you think is the main thing that you have to consider when you're doing a comic as opposed to writing a novel?
That you're telling a story visually. I mean, if you're writing a novel, that's the purest form of storytelling. You can write an entire chapter where you're going to have two people sitting in a room talking, and as long as the conversation is interesting, that's fine. In a comic book, if you are going to write two people sitting in a room talking, you're going to have them doing something that's going to make it interesting visually. You have to always be considering, what is this going to look like? What can I give the artist that he can make the pictures something that will pull the readers through, because interesting dialogue is not enough. The stories are always told visually. You have to very much keep that in mind when you're writing.
Mark, I know you agree with that viewpoint, and we've talked about that before. How does that limit you in what you're trying to tell when you're trying to tell a story, or does it?
I think it limits you in terms of how much ground you can cover, but that's about it. I think that because what a comic is really is it's like 100 Polaroids is what it is. It's give or take. It's these frozen moments, and you can tell as much or as little story as you can fit in that space. But even still, obviously, if you're doing serial fiction, if you're doing comics or even graphic novels, there's a limit to how much verbiage you can get across. There's a limit to the depth of the story, depending upon how much space you've got in the comics. That's what Peter said. It's a visual medium, and it has to be considered that way because in novels, above and beyond what Peter said, I mean, also in novels, conflict tends to be internalized as much as externalized a lot of times, whereas in comics that doesn't play as well. That not all conflict needs to be externalized.
You don't want them to turn into monologuing and you know.
Right, exactly. It's got to be when I'm now publisher at Humanoids, and we've been doing stuff in Europe for a million years, and some of the best-selling graphic novels of all time. So I'm really thrilled to be part of that world, and I'm reminded now as a publisher looking at proposals and approving projects, the first question I always ask is, why is this a comic? is there a reason this couldn't be a novel or a stage play or a film? And if it could be those things, I'm not as interested.
I will mention that part of the reason that comic books don't have the internal thoughts anymore is because thought balloons really seem to have gone away. I mean, if you look back when Chris Claremont was writing the X books, everybody was always thinking everything. I mean, Storm would walk into a room and she would have 3 thought balloons. And she'd walk in and say, this room, it's so cramped, so small. It reminds me of when I was a child and the building I was in collapsed from a bomb and I was trapped beneath those bricks, which has caused me to become claustrophobic ever since. Please, Goddess, someone open a window. That was typical for something that Chris would write. And fans were accustomed to having their characterizations spoon-fed to them in that way. But in more recent years, like in the past 15 to 20, comic books have really moved away from thought balloons. They have been replaced to some degree by first-person narrative captions, which is probably why Wolverine has become so popular. But generally speaking, the characters don't really think anymore, which, when you think about it, makes comic books closer to movies and television, because in movies and television, you don't know, generally speaking, what the characters are thinking. You have to judge them by the things they say, and even more importantly, the actions that they take.
Let me ask you about another issue that people don't understand when it comes to writing for comics is how much of a collaborative effort it is, because you can't just do it yourself and the artist just sucks it up and draws exactly what you want, right? I mean, you have to work with editors and everybody else in a way that a novelist doesn't have to.
Yeah, it is a supremely collaborative medium. It is. I'm sorry, Peter. I didn't want to interrupt you. I'm sorry.
No, go ahead.
It's a purely collaborative medium. I always say that it's my story until such time as I hand it to the editor and it goes to an artist. At that point, it's our story. And as long as we're pulling in the same direction, as long as you keep the lines of communication open with your artist, I always make sure they've got my email, my phone number, what information they need to contact me, and we can talk about the story. And they're going to have better ideas for visually pacing some things sometimes, because that's what they do. They stare at a page for a day that took me 20 minutes to write. So I'm very mindful of that. And I'm also very mindful of the fact that, again, what I do in a week, it takes them a month to do the next step. And so I'm very flexible and mindful of that in terms of if they want to make changes or if they see things a little differently, as long as we're still telling the same story, I'm willing to be perfectly adaptable to that. And you have to be. The worst thing you can be is a writer who expects your artist just to be an art robot and do what you told them to do. Even if they're really good, they're not going to be invested in the work, and it's going to show.
I always like what Kurt Busiek said. Kurt said that as long as the artist doesn't change his story without asking, he won't redraw the artist's pictures without asking.
Right, yeah.
Which makes sense. I mean, when I'm writing a script, I write full script. I used to write what's called Marvel style, but now I break it down panel by panel, and I put all the dialogue in. However, I do not do visual descriptions of what the page layout should be. I leave that entirely to the artist, because my feeling is this guy's job is drawing. Who am I to tell him how to draw? I can tell him what to draw, but not how to draw. And indeed, on occasion, an artist will come up with something better than what I came up with. And most of the time, like 95% of the time, the artist says, what would you think if I did this instead? And I go, absolutely, that sounds great. Are there times when the artist screws up? Yeah, but that's gonna happen. And as the writer, you kind of have to just adapt with it and go with it. I mean, sometimes you have to come in and fix what the artist did, and you just do the best you can. But I have been blessed with working with some of the greatest artists in the history of the business. So I consider myself very fortunate in terms of my collaborators.
Let me state to all our people who are typing here, use the Q&A button if you have questions, because that's what I was looking at. People are putting it in the chat, and I was going, why isn't anyone asking questions? And they're all in the chat. So I'll get to them.
No, I've got 4 people on the Q&A right there.
Yeah, I've seen a couple. Well, 3 of them are from the same person. So we'll get there soon enough. I have one more question I want to talk about, which is writing already existing characters. I mean, Peter, you've certainly written Star Trek, Babylon 5, quite a few worlds, and of course many of the comics are, but you've also created your own Star Trek world, so you got around that issue. Mark,
yes.
A lot of your stuff is characters that have been established for a long time. Do you find that freeing or limiting in some ways? I guess is what I'm asking. We'll start with Mark, because I.
Well, my answer is probably not what most people's answer would be, because I didn't get into comics to be a writer. I never really thought I was going to be a writer. I thought maybe an editor, but I never thought I would have enough ideas to actually write comics for a living. So it wasn't until I was in my late 20s and I left staff at DC and I was looking for something to do that writing became available to me. So I never have felt like the artist in the garret with a deep burning passion to tell his stories. For me, it is the attraction is more, I get to play with the toys that I loved as a kid, and I get to sort of in a way give back to those characters in ways they gave to me when I was young. So I like doing creator-owned stuff, and I've done plenty of my own creator-owned stuff, but I'm not going to say I enjoy it less. I enjoy it in a different way, but it's not, in a way, it is more limiting to me because I have to world build. I have to think about things from the ground up. I have to do all the things that made me never think I was going to be a writer to begin with. Whereas, if you give me Batman, look, I know I get the Batcave and Commissioner Gordon and Robin to play with. I've got the bricks, to build the building already. So I personally, my answer is probably a little off the beaten path there for most comic writers, but that's the appeal to me.
Peter?
Comic books are modern mythologies when you get right down to it. Do you know what the definition of mythology is? Something's mythic. It means that it is defined without parameters. For instance, if you say to somebody, who is Ironside? They'll say, oh, well, he was a character in a TV series created in the 1960s. He's played by Raymond Burr. If you say to someone, who is King Arthur? They say, oh, he's the ruler of Camelot. For that matter, if you say to someone, who's James T. Kirk? They'll say, oh, he's the commander of the Enterprise. They won't say he is a character who was created in the 1960s in a TV series called Star Trek. Mm. Comic books are the same thing. If you ask the average person, who is Peter Parker? They won't say, oh, he was a character created in Amazing Fantasy number 15 in 1963, I think it was. No, they'll say, oh, he's Spider-Man. Who is Superman? Oh, who is Clark Kent? Oh, he's secretly Superman, the last son of Krypton. They will define the characters within the they will say who they are. And there is no context beyond that. And so what people like Mark and I are doing is one of the oldest, so to speak, professions in humanity. We are myth making. We are contributing to modern day legends. We are spinning our stories just the same way that 1,000 years ago, people were spinning stories about King Arthur. Lancelot did not show up in the King Arthur mythology until around the 12th century when the French were writing him, because the French were sitting there going, you know what this story needs? It needs a knight who is the best knight in the world, and the wife falls and the queen falls in love with him, and of course he must be French. Really, to a certain degree, Lancelot is the very first Mary Sue in the history of writing. So I feel that I'm doing everything I can to help weave this vast tapestry, and if I can contribute in some way, shape, or form to furthering that mythos, building upon the universe that already exists, I'm perfectly happy with that. Fortunately enough, I have my own characters and my own creations that I indulge in, whether it be the New Frontier series from Star Trek books, whether it's Sir Apropos of Nothing for novels, whether it's The Fallen Angel for comic books. I am very aware of the fact that something like 85% of the people in this country do jobs that they don't like. They do the jobs in order to earn money and pay the bills and put food on the table and support their wives or husbands and kids. I'm part of the incredibly lucky 15% who does something that he loves doing for work. I try never to lose sight of that.
Well, I think many of us here in the Pocono Liars Club would want to be that percentage as well. You know, we're all trying to make it as well. So yeah, we're all envious of you guys. Congratulations. I think some talent might have something to do with it. There's a lot of questions here that I want to pin on having to do with how did you get started in this sort of thing? Now, Mark, I know that you got started as an editor. I do remember, a quick story. I remember visiting you in New York when you were an editor at DC, and you took me around and you introduced me to everybody else there. And I had no idea who any of them were. And I feel so embarrassed. And, you know, you're going, this is Joe Smith. And I'm going, okay. So please forgive me for not knowing who
Not
they
at
were.
all.
Anyway, how do people get started? Let's say I have an idea. I want to write a Superman script. How do I even submit it? How do I get started in this business?
That one's tough. I mean, if you want to start with established characters, that's a really hard place to. You can't
also, Mark, let's keep in mind that there's two answers for that. It depends whether you want to be a writer or if you want to be an artist.
That's true.
If you're an artist, it's much easier. Yeah. You can send your story samples to the editors of comic books that you like, and if they really like your story samples, you may get a call. If you're a writer and you want to send story samples, God only knows when or if they're ever going to get around to reading it. And the big problem is that the companies used to have someone whose job it was to look for new talent. And at this point, I don't think either Marvel or DC has someone like that.
Well, also, they've been lawyered out in the sense that, you know, DC and Marvel no longer even look at blind submissions for characters that they own. So you have to create your body of work first. You have to create some sort of body of work that's yours and be able to show that you know how to use the medium, how to use the tools. Now, the good news about that is that, you know, 15 years ago, when you asked the question about how do you break into comics, it's a long, convoluted, you got to go to Kinko's and print up a bunch of mini comics and take them to conventions. And now we have the internet. We've completely democratized the creation of comics. So if you want to be in comics, do something, put it on a web page, you're in comics. Congratulations. And in fact, as an editor and a publisher, when I look at people's, you know, and I tell people, do your own web comic and do it for 6 months or a year, whatever you want to do. What I look at not only is the quality of it, but I see that if you've been doing it on a regular basis, like every week you post something and you've got a regular strip going, I am impressed by your work ethic, because that tells me that you are reliable. It tells me that you have a work ethic, and that gets you another step ahead of the next guy in line, because I know I can count on you to produce work on a regular basis. And it doesn't matter.
Much easier with the advent of computers, just building upon what you said, it's much easier to find someone to work with you. In the days before computers, if you were a writer and you wanted to find an artist, you might be able to find somebody if you go to enough conventions. Nowadays, if you put out onto the computer and you go online, if you go on Twitter or Facebook and say, hi, I need an artist to do this. This is the kind of story I want to tell. Please, if you're interested, send submissions. You'll get deluged, because plenty of artists out there who also want to break in. And if you have ideas that they can work with you on, they're going to show up out of nowhere.
We mostly deal with, you know, fiction writers here in our organization, in our little club, and they, when we have people come to talk to us, they say things like, always start at the top. Send your novel to the big publishers first, to the big agents first, and work your way down. And you're saying it works the exact opposite, because you've got to prove yourself first. Instead of, you know, no one's going to hire you no matter how good you are, because they don't know you're good yet.
It's exactly that. And it has to do, again, with the fact that we're dealing with companies that are dealing in existing properties. I mean, if it's Image Comics or some of the other publishers that publish exclusively creator-owned stuff, things that you own or things that you share a percentage of, it's a little different. But even still, you know, with the other publishers, you really kind of got to start and show that you've got the chops, and then come in. You can't just go pitch for the Yankees.
Well, yeah. How did you guys first get started? Tell us a story about your first publication.
Peter, you have a good story. Go ahead.
Well, you can't really go by me because I started out working in the Marvel offices. I was working as the assistant direct sales manager and then eventually sales manager. And editorial is something that I just kind of grafted over to. When I first tried to pitch to editorial, I didn't get anywhere because there was this real division between editorial and sales. And I went around pitching ideas to editors that occurred to me, and nobody was the slightest bit interested in listening to anything I had to say. And there was this one editor named Jim Owsley. Now, Jim was a young black guy. The reason that that's pertinent to this conversation is that he felt, I don't know rightly or wrongly, but he felt that people did not give him the time of day because he was black. I know this because he told me this. He was the assistant editor to Larry Hama, and people would walk into their office and say, "Is Larry here?" And Jim would say, "No, he's not. Can I help you?" And they would go, "No, I'll come back," and they'd leave. If I walked into the office and I'd say, "Is Larry here?" Jim would say, "No, he's not. Can I help you?" And I'd say, "Sure." And I sat down because I didn't give a damn about his skin color. I just needed something. If he would give it to me, fine. I didn't care. But that meant a lot to Owsley. And then eventually Owsley became a full editor, and he became the editor of Spider-Man. And suddenly all the people that Jim felt didn't have the time for him suddenly wanted to bend his ear about Spider-Man. And Jim took great delight in saying, "Oh, I'll have to get back to you," to freezing them out. I walked into his office and I said, "I have an idea for a Spider-Man book, for a story." And Jim said, "Close the door." I said, "Okay." He says, "Sit down." I sat down. He said, "Tell me the story." I pitched the idea to him. He loved it. It saw print in Spectacular Spider-Man issue 103, I think it was. He had me do a few other stories, and then he fired Al Milgrom off Spectacular Spider-Man, which did not go well with editorial because Al was a very popular guy, and put me in charge of Spectacular Spider-Man. And editorial absolutely erupted because who was this sales guy that was going to be writing Spectacular Spider-Man? You didn't get to come in and start writing Spider-Man. He was the character that you had to work your way up to, which is why I thought it was hilarious when people were decrying J.J. Abrams' son writing a Spider-Man miniseries for the exact same reason that editorial decried my writing Spider-Man. You don't start with Spider-Man, you work your way up. And I wrote Spectacular Spider-Man for about a year, and then Owsley fired me off the book, basically in order to try and save his job. Because Shooter really didn't like me on the book, and Shooter basically said he's got to go, and Jim fired me, which I thought was hilarious, not the time, but some months ago I ran into Owsley at a convention, and Owsley said to me, "Why did you leave Spider-Man anyway?" And I said, "Because you fired me." And he said, "I did? No, I didn't." I went, "Yes, you did." Now, the fortunate thing was, some months later, Bob Harris came to my office to offer me the Incredible Hulk. And I said, "Aren't you worried you're going to get pushback from editorial?" And Bob said, "No, because nobody else wants to write the Hulk." I said, "What do you mean nobody else?" He says, "I've gone to every other writer and to every editor who writes on the side. Nobody wants to write the Hulk. So no one's going to complain if you write it because nobody cares about it." And I went, "Okay." And that's how I wound up writing the Hulk.
Well, Mark, what's your story, first publication?
First publication was the luckiest day of my life. I had wanted to I mean, I said I didn't want to be a writer. That's not really true. I just didn't think I could be a writer. But I sold on a trip to New York in 1984. I sold Julie Schwartz, who was the editor of Superman at the time. I sold him an 8-page Superman story blind. I knew him because I was working with a fan press, and he knew me as a fan. But that was the greatest professional day of my life. And then I sold nothing for another 5 years. But that got me in the office. And it's, between that and my work in the fan press, it opened the door for me to be an editor at DC. And the reason that's pertinent to the whole writing career is because in the 2 years and change I was an editor up there, because I was working on the anthology titles, I was working with literally every writer in comics. So all these scripts came across my desk, and it was boot camp. I learned more in 2 years of being an editor about writing than I could have in 10 years on my own. So when I struck out on my own, left editorial, and was looking for something to do, I made enough friends during editorial where this guy would throw me something and this guy would throw me something, and before you know it, I managed to luck onto Flash, which is really the big thing in my career, and took off from there. But being an editor, man, I got this again, making it pertinent to the people who are listening and what they're kind of what they're looking for in terms of information. Being an editor was invaluable, not only from what I learned from reading the scripts, but just because I know what I expect of my freelancers as an editor. I know what I expect of my writers as an editor. And so now that I'm on the other side of the desk, I know my job. My job is to solve your problems. As a writer, my job is to make your life easier, Mr. Editor, and get you home at 5 o'clock and do the best job I can, and not, and fight for my work, but don't be so pig-headed about it that I become difficult to work with. Just, learning all those things was enormously helpful to me.
Well, I definitely agree as far as the editing going, even with fiction, because the more I edit, the more anthologies I edit, the more I learn about what is good writing. You learn by watching others, by studying, and talking about it. Here's a question. Has either of you ever done a graphic story project outside of a publishing company environment? And if you had, how did that get pulled together in terms of finding the artist, that sort of thing? I see confusion about the question.
Yeah.
I read it straight. Interpret it how you wish.
I think if I'm interpreting correctly, I think you mean rather than it being an assignment, mm-hmm. It's something that I like if I was going to write a novel, and I would start completely from scratch and then worry about who to sell it to later. If I'm understanding the question, it's, have I ever done that with a graphic novel, found my own artist, pulled people together? And I have, actually. I started my own publishing company online called Thrillbent a few years ago, and that involved me coming up with ideas completely on my own and having to hire the artist, having to hire the letters, the colorist, and doing all the production and so forth. So I've done a little bit of that, and it can be very rewarding, but it is also incredibly time consuming. It's, writing a novel is you put words on paper and you hand it to an editor. Writing a comic and managing a comic, that's, you're producing, you're doing a whole bunch of different things. You're not running the press, you're not setting the type.
I've done some original graphic novels, but they were always handled by publishers. The publishers got the artist. I mean, on occasion, I was the one who chose the artist. For example, I did a Sir Apropos of Nothing. Well, actually, it was a series of comic books, which was then collected into a graphic novel. But I chose the artist for that. I picked Robin Riggs, with whom I had worked on some other stuff. But that was published by IDW. And now it's being republished by Comic Mix. But no, I've never had to do all the work myself, and the publishers always take care of it.
I think this is an interesting question. Is there a story that you have never got to tell that you really want to, either on your own original characters or through someone else's property?
No.
Is there a Superman story you always wanted to tell, for example?
My usual answer to that used to be, I want to do a story in which the Phantom meets Tarzan. But then I basically wound up doing that story when I was hired to do a 5-issue Phantom Limited series. We were not able to use Tarzan, but I did a Tarzan-like character and basically told the story I would have wanted to tell. So there's a John Carter story that I would love to write, but other than that, and you know what? I'd really like to write Doc Savage. I don't know what the hell I would do with him, but I would love to write Doc Savage.
Mark?
And for me, there's one Superman story that outlined, you know, for years and years and years. And it may still be years and years and years before I get a chance to tell it. But if I can get that one off my plate, then there's not a whole lot else. I mean, I'm very, very lucky. I've been, and you know, Peter understands this too. I'm very lucky to have a career as long as we have had, and as uninterrupted as we have had. That I've been, I generally take my work through assignment. It's generally, hey, we want you to do Daredevil for 12 issues or whatever, and then I will go off and think about Daredevil stories. It's not so much that I sit here and think about the stories that I want to do somewhere down the road. It's generally by assignment. It's generally something that, you know, I'm going to be paid for one way or another. The one Superman story is in the back of my head, and you know, if we all live long enough, we'll read it.
You know, I would love to tell the story that I thought Superman 4 was going to be. Because I'm sitting there in the theater, I'm watching Superman 4, and Superman gets up in front of the United Nations and says, I have decided that I'm going to get rid of every nuclear weapon in the world. And immediately the rest of the movie flashes through my mind. The UN is going to go, you're going to what? And Superman's going to say, I'm going to get rid of nuclear weapons. And they're going to say, you're out of your mind. You're a private citizen. You can't get rid of nuclear weapons. They're our weapons. And he's going to say, well, I've given this a lot of thought, and I've decided that I'm just going to get rid of them. They say, you touch a single one of our nuclear weapons, and you're going to be an enemy of the planet. And Superman's going to go, well, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm going to do what I feel I have to do. And he's going to take off, and suddenly it's Superman versus the world. And who's the world going to turn to in their time to try and stop Superman? Lex Luthor.
Of course.
Because of course.
Yes, of course.
And Lex Luthor is going to be the good guy to try to stop Superman from getting rid of all the nuclear weapons. All of this went through my head in a second. And I thought, this is going to be the greatest Superman film ever. And then the next second,
you guys might not be able to see it, but Mark is covering his face right now.
Yeah,
I saw
face palming right now. Yeah. Right.
And the UN, in the next second, UN stood up and went, "Yay!" And I went, "Oh, Jesus Christ!" Yeah, I did exactly what Mark just did, and I knew that this movie's going to go straight down the crapper.
No! Mark, I did the same thing you did because I was reacting to what you were saying, not because of what the movie was. So we've had this discussion before.
Yes.
Yeah,
this is. Everything you said just makes perfect sense. Everything you said is the perfectly logical extension of the way that story would go. But that's not what I buy for a Superman story for. That's not what I want to see in a Superman story.
Yeah.
What I love about if I buy into the fact the guy can fly, if I buy into the fact that a guy from a distant galaxy looks just like us, I have to buy into the verisimilitude of, you know what? He's the one guy in the world that everybody trusts because he trusts everybody because he takes care of everybody. He is and again, I know that's a child's fantasy take on the character, but that's what the character is. That's what the character is. He was created by. I'll tell you something.
When the first movie came out and they said you believe a man can fly.
Yeah.
I came out of that movie and I still did not believe a man could fly. However, I did believe that a man could convincingly look like somebody else with just a pair of glasses. When he took off the glasses and stood up and straightened his shoulders and turned into Superman in front of our eyes and said, "Lois, there's something I have to tell you," I went, okay, I believe the glasses. Never believed it during the George Reeves days, but I believe it now.
I still remember Mark and I went to see Superman 2 when it opened and walked out of that, and he was so frustrated with all the extra stupid things they gave him in that film.
It was one of the most crushing days of my life.
Frisbee, what the hell
I was glad I was there to comfort you.
It was, yes. It was. I remember just practically in tears going, this is the worst sequel ever, because why is it funny? It doesn't need to be funny. But, you know, I've grown up a little bit since then. I begin to see the charm in it. So anyway,
here's another question. What would you recommend for new writers to improve their skills if they want to do this? Is there any book out there? Has anyone written anything that you would advise them to take? Or
Yes, I would suggest they get Writing for Comics and Graphic Novels by me. You can find it for like $2.99 on Amazon with no problem.
Mark, you agree?
Yes. Peter's is a good place to go. Denny O'Neil wrote a really good book on how to write comics. it says the DC way, but that's only because it was done under the DC rubric. It's really how to write comics. There's a couple. Brian Bendis did a book like that.
Scott Snyder.
Yeah.
Right. Scott Snyder's book. Not Scott
I'm
Snyder. Scott McCloud.
Scott McCloud. Yep.
Yeah.
I'm working on one now. So there's places to go, but really, that's like 102. If you're going to go for class 101 and you want to get involved, it's really just thinking about a story that you can break down into 100 Polaroid photographs, and still making sure it's a story, making sure that, because what's a story? A story is somebody wants something, something's in their way, and on the other side of that obstacle, there's some consequence. And if you can do that and build that out of 100 snapshots, then that's your first start into doing a graphic novel.
That's got to be somewhat frustrating too, trying to make things fit, make sure you don't have too much dialogue that's going to obscure things.
Oh yeah, and it's the number one mistake everybody makes coming in. It's suddenly there's 9 panels on a page and there's 85 balloons of dialogue and there's just no room for anything.
Doesn't matter who you are. Everyone makes that mistake. I mean, in X-Men #1, there's a famous panel where Magneto is facing some army guys and Magneto is talking, and the word balloon covers Magneto from his head to just below his ankles. It's just freaking hilarious. Even Stan screwed it up from time to time.
Another question. Do you think monthly physical comics will survive for much longer, or are we moving towards a Netflix-style subscription service versus paying for individual issues? What's the future going to be?
People have been predicting that monthly comic books are going to be going away for 20 years. I mean, is it possible that comics will go away? Is it possible that it will reach the point where you physically cannot make enough money to sell them? I suppose it's possible. I sure hope that doesn't happen, but it's possible.
It's certainly possible. I mean, I'm a little more doomsaying than Peter, but not much. I mean, I still want to believe that they'll still be existing, but
exactly.
just watching the market right now with, the consequences of the pandemic and the way that has interrupted the flow of comics. So what I'm finding is, as publishers who've had to stop publishing monthlies for 2 or 3 months, as they're starting back up, they're having a difficult time making sure the same number of readers are coming back because some of those people have moved on. And so the reigniting the momentum that you have to have a monthly book continue to have the same sales every month or roughly, it's harder to do. And again, comics just become exponentially more expensive all the time, but there's still something about that weekly hit, that fix that the junkies need on every Wednesday to go in the store, and stores become communities. Stores become, places where you can go and hang out with other like-minded people. And so that gives them the advantage that, yeah, you can buy it on Amazon too, but it's not the same. I think that there's still some life in that old horse yet. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you got to see mini scripts as an editor and that helped you along. Is it possible, is there some place we could go to see scripts? Preferably yours, both of you guys.
Peter, there's at least one site online, right? There's I know Nat. No, I'm trying to remember who. You know what, Mike? We'll send you. I'll do the research on this, and you can, put that on a website or something down there. Farm it out later. I can give you there's actual websites with people who have had comic scripts, like they collected over the years, put up.
Okay, I think the person who was writing this really wanted to see you guys, more than anybody else's. So I didn't know if you've ever posted any of your stuff up.
I don't post them. I sell my scripts when I go to conventions.
I'm not that smart, but I will.
Basically, I had a lot of would-be artists coming up to me going, where can I get scripts so I can practice my storytelling? I had a number of would-be writers coming to me saying, where can I get scripts so I can see what the format looks like? And I'm going, a marketplace. So I started selling scripts, and it goes quite well.
All right.
Good. Well, this is an interesting question. I'll throw it out there and see what you guys have to say. If you have a great idea, you have a good idea, how do you decide whether it's a novel or a screenplay or a graphic novel or other? I always choose other myself.
Other is good. Yes. Is it a Gaelic poem? Yes.
It depends on the idea. I mean, some ideas seem to be so massive that a novel is the only way that you can do it. Others seem to suggest that they should be done as a screenplay. I mean, it really depends upon the idea as it comes to you and as it develops as you think about it.
Yeah. I would say that in the most general terms, if it's a story that is largely dialogue driven or needs to be largely dialogue driven, then it's probably a stage play. It's probably maybe a movie. But if it's a story that has a strong visual component or needs a strong visual component to be able to be told, the Iliad would be a terrible, you need something that is visual. That's a terrible analogy. Let's just run the clock back on that and pretend I didn't say that. That super general terms. That would be my answer to that question.
Someone asked, do you prefer the Marvel method or traditional scripting?
Peter.
Full scripting. I mean, I've written them both ways, and I switched over to writing full scripts. I far prefer it. It enables me to take greater control of the story. It prevents me from putting in too much story for an artist to be able to interpret. And it just puts me far more in control of what's happening. It also forces me to think more visually because I have to plan it out panel by panel by panel. So since I'm describing what's going to be happening in each and every panel, I must think visually, which when you're writing a comic book is the way to do it.
I mean, for me, and let me just back up a little bit, just for anybody who might not know, what we say when we say Marvel method versus full script, what we mean is full script like a TV script, like a movie script, versus the Marvel method of which Stan Lee perfected in the 60s, which was give the artist a real rough plot, let the artist be more involved in the actual pacing, the actual storytelling, and then once the pages come back, you add dialogue based on the story that you had in mind and what the characters are doing. And that's kind of a fun way to work if you're working with the right artist and you're in sync. And sometimes that's fun. That said, I'm with Peter. I prefer full script, not only because it forces me to think, more about what I'm doing in the moment, but also because I find when I do Marvel style, I sell out the Mark Waid of 30 days from now because I'll write something that says, he'll say something clever here and I'll send it to the and then it'll come back and it's due that day and I'm looking at all these pages and my plot notes say, he says something clever here. So I've got to be really funny whether or not my dog's got to go to the vet or I've got a toothache and I've got to be witty and on point and it's due that day. So full script means it's done. I refine it. It's like I like it. It's out the door. I don't have to depend on me 30 days from now being clever.
One of the reasons I switched to full script was that I wouldn't say, then he says something clever. In my Marvel style scripts, I would always put in all the dialogue because I just felt it was important so that for the artist to know. When I was then had to turn around and do the scripting, I was basically doing the same job twice because now I had to go and retype all the dialogue that I had done the first time. So I was spending a couple of hours duplicating my efforts. And I'm sitting there going, why am I doing this? So that was part of the reasons I switched to full script.
What do most editors look for? I mean, if you're trying to sell an idea to a smaller publisher, do they expect it to be in the full script?
Yeah, if you're trying to sell an idea to a publisher, you're not talking about script. The first thing you're talking about is a pitch. You want to do something that's going to be a proposal of what your story is going to be. You put the basic theme, you put what it's going to be about. Ideally, if there's any shocking twists that are in there, you put that in there. That's the thing that you're going to sell. And ideally, it should be no more than a couple of pages at most.
Right. In fact, if
you're trying to get the attention of the publisher, go ahead.
I'm sorry. If you go on the humanoids.com website, I specifically drafted a form, basically a template for people to use when they want to pitch stories, series, whatever they want to pitch. And it's like Peter said, it's just basic stuff. Here's the elevator pitch. Okay, here's the story in a paragraph. Okay, here's the characters. Okay, here's what they're after. It's and as brief as you possibly can. Like you said, it's 2 pages at most, because again, I get back to the 100 Polaroids analogy. If you can't tell your story to me in 2 pages, I can't trust you to do it in 20 comic book pages. It's part of being a comics writer, graphic novel writer, is the economy of storytelling. You don't have a whole lot of real estate to play around with. Every panel is precious. It's, the opening of Reservoir Dogs would make a terrible comic because it would take 6 pages of comics to tell. And by that time, you're a quarter of the way through the comic and you haven't gone anywhere yet. It's, it's look at Watchmen as again, I always use the exemplar of the economy of storytelling. Every line of dialogue means something. Every illustration means something. There's no fat on that animal at all.
Someone's asking, what about new heroes, new characters, new settings, even if it's just new to the general public? He says, I got bored with the sameness of Marvel and DC. Characters I knew but absolutely loved Alita. Are there any new venues or avenues for them to rise to the top?
Sure. I go ahead, Peter. I'm sorry.
No, I was leaning forward to listening to what you were going to say.
I was going to say, yeah, I mean, there's the good news is there's a jillion publishers out there, and a lot of them still deal in action adventure material. So if you can find a comic store near you, that's the best place to go, because they will be able to point you in the right direction for the stuff you like. If not, go browse around on Comixology or something like that, or even on Amazon's comics department. But yeah, there's still plenty of, you don't have to be limited. Just because you've fallen out of love with DC and Marvel stuff doesn't mean there's not room for you to find action adventure or heroic fantasy out there. There's still plenty of it.
There was a guy who had a comic book he wanted to do called My Monkey's Name is Jennifer. He came up to me. No, I didn't think he came up to me. I think he mailed it to me. And I read, it was illustrated. It was black and white. It was Xeroxes. And I read it, and it was just the most demented thing that I'd ever read. And in my column, But I Digress, shortly before San Diego, I wrote about it. And I said, I just saw this thing called My Monkey's Name is Jennifer. It's really twisted. I hope somebody publishes it because it's insane. And he didn't know I did that. And he goes around to publishers at San Diego, and to his shock, they all go, oh, My Monkey's Name is Jennifer. Yes, absolutely. I definitely want to see that show. To me. Oh, this is great. He had no idea why everyone knew who the hell he was. And then someone said, oh, I read all about it in But I Digress. So that's how he found out about it. And indeed, the comic book was indeed published. So, you just have to be willing to do what you can to get your work out there.
So you heard it. Heard it right here, folks. The way to do it is to mail it to Peter. Whatever, no matter what your idea is, no matter what your crazy concept is, mail it to Peter.
Well, unfortunately, But I Digress no longer exists because
you can still mail it to Peter.
Exists. But
do you guys, when you write something that's for somebody else, do you get any compensation for when they use your ideas in the futures? And the question that Derek asked actually is sort of along those lines. Do you get any payment for animated movies and series based on your comics? Young Justice, Gotham by Gaslight, etc., he says.
Well, I got to work on the Young Justice animated series, so that's something. I did get bonus money from DC because of my influence on the Aquaman movie, which was completely unexpected. It was just one day I got a letter from Mike Carlin and Dan, and it said, "Hi, we're sending you money." And it's like, okay, that was unexpected, but it's very much appreciated. I did not get any money for Spider-Man 2099 showing up in Into the Spider-Verse. However, I did get money for the character of Talos because he was in Captain Marvel, and they made Talos T-shirts and Talos action figures. So I did get some money from that. So that was nice.
So the answer is sometimes, depending.
Yeah, the answer is basically sometimes.
Yeah, it's pretty discretionary on the companies, because here's the thing. I mean, you know the rules going in. And if you're going to be working on a Marvel or DC script, that's cooked. You're not you're selling them the script. They're paying you reasonably well. You'll get royalties off sales, but anything beyond that, unless you've carved out a special side deal or something, which most people don't get a chance to do, they're not obligated to. But I will say that DC in particular has been very good about discretionary payments. Here's, we use some of your stuff in the Flash TV show. Here's a check, and it's not buy a car money. It's nice night at, nice dinner for a few nights.
Well, I don't know.
Back when we used to have restaurants. Okay, huh?
Paul Dini told me that he got like last year or so.
Yeah.
He got a check for Harley Quinn.
Yeah.
And he said he got it in like March or April. He
Yeah.
said he didn't have to work the rest of the year.
Yeah. That is the exception, because Harley is just taking the hell off. And yeah. But so it can happen. I will say I got a nice check off of Man of Steel because they used pieces of Birthright in it, and I'm glad about that. And they didn't have to do that, but it's, so I guess to turn the question around, if you're an adult about it, you're not resentful when you don't get it, because that's not part of the contract. It's nice when it happens.
Well, you got mentioned in the last.
Honestly, did I enjoy getting money for it? Yeah, but I got a bigger kick out of seeing my name scroll by in the thanks section at the end of the film.
Yeah,
I thought Mark, you had the same thing happen to you, right?
Yeah, same thing. When no matter how long I live, no matter how much money I make off the Flash, past, present, future, when I'm watching my TV and somebody uses the word Speed Force for the first time, there's a photo of me that my then girlfriend took of me in that moment with my jaw hanging open, and I felt something. Or when, in the Man of Steel movie, when they say the S it stands for hope, that's me. That's something I did. And so that's, frankly, they sent me money for Superman. I don't remember what I spent the money on, but I'll remember for the rest of my life hearing that in the movie, hearing some of my dialogue from a Birthright comic being spoken on a big screen. That was very cool.
Talk about the cliche of comics is especially that it's a white male dominated field. Are there many women? Are there any people of color in the comic field? Is it growing commensurate with the population, or are we still behind?
I haven't the slightest idea how much it's grown. Are there more blacks, Hispanics, Asian women working in comics? Yes, definitely. Is it all just middle-aged Jewish men? No, not anymore. What the percentages are, I haven't the faintest idea.
I have a little more insight on that just because of what I do. It has grown. It is obviously it's going to be behind. It's always going to be behind. It's always going to be behind. But the thing that, and this is not to excuse it in any way, shape, or form. I'm thrilled that there are just so many more, people of color, people of gender working in the industry than there were when I started in the mid '80s. There's never enough, and we need to keep moving that way. But the piece of the puzzle is that for years, it's our fault as an industry, because for years and years and years and years, comics publishers published comics specifically aimed at white kids, white boys. That was the audience. And so when we wanted to throw open the doors to people of color, to people of gender, to people who weren't that, and we threw open the doors and there wasn't a line outside and there was a bunch of crickets and tumbleweeds, that's because we didn't give them anything that why would they even want to work in comics if we've been publishing just stories for white kids all these years? So it took the, a little bit more of us making an effort to try to move in that direction by hiring the right people, by hiring people with distinct voices, by hiring more inclusivity, using more inclusivity, more that, and I'm not phrasing that well. These are weird times, we're all rattled. By being more inclusive, that created comics with a more distinct voice, and therefore more people heard that voice, and more people would come to us and say, okay, comics is something maybe there's something here. So that is a really long-winded way of saying that we were late to the game, but I do think we have made a lot of progress in a relatively short amount of time. There's still a long way to go.
Final question, because we're running out of time, and then if you guys can stick around after I turn the recording off, we open it up for anybody else. Unless you have to go, we understand.
Sure.
And
No,
then
as long as I'm off by 10 because Shield's on 10. So
we're not going to be that long. We can't be that.
okay.
Long. What of what you've written are you proudest of? Nice short answer. If someone wanted to read something by you, what would you say?
Honest to God, it's like saying which child am I proudest of?
Yeah.
I mean, whenever I write something, I have in my mind a mental image of what I want it to be. And if the final product is even 70 to 80% of what I wanted it to be, I'm satisfied with that. I have a number of projects that I'm very happy with. Fallen Angel, I'm very happy with. The New Frontiers Star Trek series, and Imzadi, one of my Trek novels, I'm very proud of. Sir Apropos of Nothing, I'm very proud of. Future Imperfect, I'm thrilled with. I mean, Future Imperfect is probably, if I had to pick a single comic story of mine that I would suggest someone write, I'd probably choose that one. But, picking one thing, that's a problem.
Sorry.
Mark? To make up for my long-winded answer previously, I will just say that the only answer is Superman Birthright. That's it. It's my love letter to Superman. It is everything I loved about that character. It gave me a chance to show other people why I thought he was a great character, and that's the thing I'm proudest of.
I will recommend that as well.
Thank you.
I will keep wishing they make a movie out of that. All right. What we're going to do now, we want to thank everyone for showing up. We want to thank our guests for being here. I'm going to stop the recording very soon. Of course, we do this every week of the Pocono Liars Club. And if you want to stick around a little bit, we'll have everyone come on. Thanks, everyone. This is a virtual clapping. You can't see it, but everybody who is participating is clapping.
Okay.
Stop.